We've been helping out our son on his HYPERADOBE build, and we're just about ready to get started on the roof. We recently finished the walls and the top plate, and now we're ready to secure the straps over the top plate to tie that down and then start attaching the roof beams. We decided to make our own roof beams out of this metal sea-purlin material. Since we already had the material, we bought it a couple of years ago before the prices went up, and we used it to build our house roof with as well, and we really liked how it turned out. It's a great, really strong, solid roof, and so we decided to use the same roof design on his house. I'm doing the final modification on these beams to fit them to his roof. I have to drill some holes so that we can bolt them to the top plate, and also have to cut out some notches for the spacer boards. Meanwhile, Kyle has been working on attaching the straps over the top plate. These wider straps are straps that we saved from the wood bundles that we got a couple of years ago that we used to build our own barn roof, and we saved them, and so it's been great to find a place to reuse them. Kyle also bought some additional straps that he's using on this roof to make sure it's really well secured. We're putting on quite a few straps here. We figure it's better to have too many than not enough, and we'll be doing the final tightening of the straps down later. We got these as tight as we could for now, but we'll finish tightening them later with wedge-shaped blocks between the strap and the top plate. With the modifications to the first beam done, we're ready to set the first one in place. These beams are 20 feet long, 6 inches tall, and the web is about 5 inches across. So they're heavy but manageable. Between the two of us, it was quite doable. We decided to start towards the middle and then just work our way out to either side. We were able to set one side of the beam up on the roof and then use ladders to get the other side up, and now it's on the roof just kind of sitting there, and we need to get it truly square with the front side of the house and positioned with the right amount of overhang. We've measured over from one side, so we have the spacing at 4-foot centers all marked out, but I want to really make sure that we get at least one side square. This structure isn't perfectly square, you know, it's an earth bag structure. You can only get it so good when you're laying bags like this. And it's actually really difficult to measure squareness when you're going around those radius corners, which I've done with 45s along this top plate, but I couldn't swear to the perfect squareness of the top plate. So when I place this first beam, I want to get it as square as I can to the front edge of the house, and then that'll be my baseline for all the other beams. Once we had the beam just where we wanted it, we marked it with a pencil along both sides, and then also marked the hole position of the hole that I pre-drilled in the beam so that we could transfer that hole to the wood, and then we just rolled the beam out of the way so that we could drill the holes in the wood. I pre-drilled the holes for the 3/8 lag bolts that we'll be using to attach it, and now I'm using a hand planer to make the slope of the top plate match the slope of the beam. I need to take about 1/4 inch off of one side. Once the slope was matched up, we're ready to check the fit. We just blew off the X material and rolled the beam back in place and made sure everything lined up and looked good. I think this is going to work, so now we just need to drive in the lag bolts to attach the beam to the top plate. I'll be using a 3-inch long, 3/8 inch thick lag bolt, and I'll be using a washer and a lock washer underneath that. This little right angle driver is handy for this. It fits in underneath that webbing. It's kind of a tight space in there, but it fits in there nicely and takes the work out of it. Here you can see the little notches that I cut out of that rolled lip on the webbing. That'll make room for the next step, which is placing a spacer board. This block board that I'm working on now will go in between the beams and will separate the interior roof space from the eave space. I cut these boards to length first, which is just under 4 feet, and now I'm cutting the height to match the height of the beams. I'm doing 2 at a time since I need one for either side of the beam. Since the beam is pretty much exactly 6 inches tall, I had to start out with a 2x8 here and cut it down to size. Unfortunately, a dimensional lumber 2x6 is 5.5 inches, so not quite wide enough. The last step was to cut a relief on the top and bottom of each side of the spacer board to make room to fit inside of the metal purlin on each side. There's a lot of different ways you could do this particular step. I'd like to use a handsaw to cut about 3/8 to 1/2 inch in on either side just as a stop, and then use my table saw to make that cut and finish removing the rest of the material. That goes pretty quickly, and if there's anything left, I just clean that up with my handsaw to get a nice clean cut, and then I cut the corners off so that it goes flush up against the inside of that C-purlin and doesn't get caught on those rounded corners. Once all the prep work is done, I'm able to just put it up on the wall, slide it inside the beam, and attach it. I'm screwing it so that it's flush with the outside of the top plate. Since I've already cut the little reliefs on either side of this spacer plate, I should be able to just put the next beam up on the wall and then slide it over into place. Making these block boards would be a lot easier on traditional wood rafters. It's just, trying to fit them in around these I-beam shaped beams and get a really nice tight seal that takes all the extra work, but it's worth putting in the extra time. We get a nice tight fit that we can seal up with just a little bit of caulk or foam later, and this roof will be an unvented roof with no attic space. Another function of these block boards is to further secure the beam down to the top plate. So since the block board goes into the beam and since the block board is screwed into the top plate, it serves to really strengthen the bond between the beam and the top plate. We're now placing the second beam. Once it's in position, we will transfer and drill the holes, bolt it down, and then create more block boards. Well, we've been working at it for a while, and we have all the center beams up, and we're ready to focus on the last three, which will be in the ends. One of the advantages of working with metal beams like this is it's incredibly strong, and so you can put them on centers that are wider than you normally would. Normally with roof beams, you'd be putting them on 16-inch centers or maybe 24-inch centers, but we can easily go 4 foot on these centers. That works out really well for your sheet building materials in 4x8 sizes, so multiples of 4 work super good and you don't have any excess materials and everything fits really nicely. So that works great. Unfortunately, the width of this house doesn't divide evenly by 4, so this last space on this one side is about 5 feet instead of 4 feet, and so I need to add an additional beam there. I don't want to try to span 5 feet. Wouldn't work out with building materials and stuff, so I added an extra beam. We're putting it on 2-foot centers. That's the one we're adding now, and then it'll be about a 3-foot gap between this beam and the very last beam, which will sit on the side wall right along the top of the top plate. Now we're just finishing up attaching that beam, the one on the 2-foot center, and here we are carrying over the last 2 beams and getting ready to prep them. These beams will be prepped a little differently than the other beams, since the bolt holes won't be in the same position as the other beams. I'll be bolting these down in multiple places all along the length, since they're going to be sitting on top of the top rail, so I'll be able to get bolts in all along instead of just at either end. While Kyle's bolting that down, I'm taking some measurements here. I'll have to build a special block board for this since it goes around that 45 to follow the radius of the wall, and I will wait until after the beam is in place to put that block board in since I'll be able to do it in 2 pieces. Now that I know where to put the holes, I am pre-drilling the holes along the length of this beam, and then we should be able to just set it up in place and get it positioned relative to the other beams. I don't believe that the top plate is perfectly square along this side, so when I set it up there, it may not follow the top plate perfectly. It'll generally be sitting on top, but I'm more concerned that it be parallel to the other beams than that it follows the top plate perfectly. And we're ready to set this beam in place. We decided to go ahead and use the scaffolding to get it up there close, and then we'll climb up on and lift it up from there. It was actually easier to do it from inside the structure. It's harder to do it from the scaffolding. Once we ended up on the scaffolding, we got in position, and then it was just one rather awkward lift and shove to get it set up on the top plate up there. Then we had to figure out how we were going to get it even with the rest of the beams. We want to get this beam positioned correctly before we transfer and drill those holes, and so we are getting it parallel with the other beams, measuring back and forth either side to get it parallel. And then to make sure that its ends line up with the other beams, I'm getting on one side with a long board and putting that board up against the previous beams and extending it out to where it's past where this beam needs to be and bringing that beam back to where it just touches. And that way I know that it'll line up with the other beams along the end. I think we've got the end of the beam lined up nicely with the other beams, and we're just doing one more check to make sure that we're still parallel with the other beams. What we found effective for that was just cutting a board to the right width and then using that as a guide to make sure that we're perfectly parallel. Once we had everything positioned correctly, we marked the holes and then moved the beam out of the way. To mark the holes, we just use a Sharpie and go around the inside of that pre-drilled hole. And then once we move the beam out of the way, we use that as a guide to drill into. We're using a 1/4 inch drill bit here, which is the correct size to pre-drill for that 3/8 inch lag bolt. Once those were pre-drilled, we moved the beam back into place, got it lined up with the holes, and then Kyle bolted it down. And here you can see that that top rail is a few inches off square on the side, but it worked out. It's still plenty wide and we had plenty of contact area between the beam and the top rail. Well, we're moving to the other side and getting ready to place the last beam. This beam, like the other side, will go along the top of the top rail along this side. Of course, the top rail isn't perfectly square with the rest of the roof on this side either, and so I'll be doing the same thing. We'll use a spacer board to get the spacing correct and make it parallel to the previous beam. The spacing on this side is the standard 4-foot spacing though. These metal roof beams have worked out really well for us. It's unconventional. I'm not sure that we would have used these if we didn't already have them. But we had them and we decided to go for it, and they've worked out really well. I love these beams. They're really strong and have been a pleasure to work with. It's kind of funny how we got these originally. We purchased them as part of our original aircrete home design, and they were going to be used in the superstructure of the home, and we eventually ended up giving up on aircrete, so we no longer needed these. Instead, we decided to repurpose them and use them as roof beams. We used them in our house, really liked how that worked out, and so we decided to use them in Kyle's house as well. The metal is also a relatively inexpensive option. For these beams, we used 2 purlins, which were $60 each, so $120 roughly, plus a little bit of change for bolts. And it makes for a fairly inexpensive roof beam. We're not sure what wood would have cost, but we only needed to use 9 beams for this roof, so that also saves money as well. I'm not sure what purlins are going for these days. We bought these a couple of years ago before we started our house, when things were a little bit less expensive and we really shopped around and got a good deal. With the last beam in place, I just needed to block in around that corner, which was going to be a little tricky. I need to follow that 45, so I'm going to cut 2 pieces and try to piece that in. I got the ones done on the other side, and you can see how those turned out. I just kind of mitered in those 45s and evenly filled in that space, going around the radius, and here's the process. I started by cutting the boards to length, and when I took the measurements on top of the rail around that 45, I just took the measurements from the outside, so I can go ahead and cut the boards exactly to length, and then when I cut the miter off, I'll just cut to the edge of the board, and I'll just be removing that extra material, but the length will stay the same. So I'm cutting the boards to length, and then I'll cut them down to width. And here I am cutting the bevels. I have the table saw set to 45 degrees. And I'm just doing this by hand, using my eye. I'm basically making it to where the blade comes out at the top corner of the wood and doesn't take anything off the length. Now I'm cutting the bevel on the other side of the board, but this bevel will not mate up with the original bevel that I cut. Since I'm using a 45, I'll actually be using a beveled edge to a square edge when I go around the corner. And now I'm cutting the bevel for the part that joins up against the beam, so it'll kind of follow the line of the beam as it joins. And I'm just innocently working along here when I get sandblasted by the occasional dust devil that we see out here in the desert. And the last thing I need to do is cut away some material around the ends so that the board is able to fit inside that last beam on the side and go over and around those lipped areas that roll up. So I just need to cut away about a ½ an inch from the width, about 4 inches back, and I'm tapering that in so that it all flows and matches up nicely as it goes into that beam. Doing this 45-degree beveled block and fitting it in around the metal is really tricky, and it's rather challenging. I know some people would find it to be tedious and miserable, but I like carpentry in general, and I find this to be a fun challenge. Well, I think I've about got all the detail work on this, and now I'm pre-drilling the holes so that it's all ready to screw into place once I get it up there. I'm toe-nailing this in, so it's nice to go ahead and pre-drill that while it's down and easy to work with, and then I get the screws started as well. Now we're up on the roof and I'm fitting it into place. It looks like my measurements were right and this is going to work, so I'm able to just screw it down in to the top plate, and then I'll also screw the two boards together as well. Well, that side looks good, so I just have to do that same thing on one more side, and that'll finish up the blocking portion of this. The dimensions on this particular side are a little bit different, since the 45s going around those radiuses were all a little bit different. The radiuses were a tiny bit different, so I had to kind of custom fit it all in. So each one of these corners has been a custom thing too. And I've got everything pretty well cut, and it looks like it's all going to fit, so I'm ready to screw it in and finish up the blocking. Well, the roof beams are all up and blocked. The next step will be to add purlins. I'll be adding those on 16-inch spacing, and they'll be extending out over the sides so we can create nice eaves along the side to match the nice eaves that we already have with the beams on the front and back.
In the next video, we will be continuing to work on the roof, and we will get some help from the rest of the family. So be sure to subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and join us again next time. Thanks for watching.